Hello and welcome to Curated Tours from the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum. We took a break through the summer as the appetite for digital programming was decreasing justifiably. Nothing more appropriate than a rainy day such as it is in London to relaunch our series for the fall 2022. I am Dr. Georgiana Stanciu and happy to welcome back my guest, Dr. St.Croix, for a quick overview of the engagement at Kowang-san or Hill 355 during the Korean War. Before we begin, I wish to go over several aspects of Zoom etiquette. The event is recorded, which is why you are muted, and please remain so. However, at the end of the talk, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. Please write them down in the chat box and we will try to answer them. At this point, I would like to thank our backup tech support, our public programmer, Sarah Coates, and just let you know that after an introduction to the topic from Dr. St.Croix, I will take the camera through the Korean War section of our permanent gallery. As usual, at the end, we have some topical photographic archives that are not on display, but I brought them up just to share them with you. Dr. St.Croix, you are on.
Perfect. Thanks for having me on again, Dr. Stanciu. It's always great to be on the series and do anything with the RCR Museum, being a Londoner by birth and being raised there myself. So, today, as Dr. Stanciu has already said, we're going to be looking at Hill 355, a place of several major battles for the Canadians in the Korean War. So just for those of you who might not be aware, I'll do a really quick introduction of the Korean War and how kind of the Canadians got into the position that they were literally there on the ground. So the Korean War begins on June 25th, 1950, with North Korean forces moving across the 38th parallel, which served as the border between North and South Korea, attacking South Korean positions along with troops from the United States. The United Nations was able to organize a force to come to South Korea's aid, which included Canada. The UN forces, as the war progressed, were eventually pushed back to the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula, known as, at the time, the Busan perimeter, until an amphibious landing took place at Incheon near Seoul, well behind the North Korean lines, forcing the North Korean forces to fall back. The UN forces were able to push the North Koreans all the way back to their border with China, which unfortunately caused China to enter the war and pushed it into a new phase where the UN forces were pushed back to around the 38th parallel. And there was a few offensives back and forth kind of at that time period, but that stabilized the front line along the 38th parallel. So Canada, as I said, contributed to the war in Korea, not just on land, but also in the air, with Canadian aviators serving with US Air Forces, and also at sea. There's a major naval contribution as well that went on even past the war. But sadly, 516 Canadians died as a result of the war in Korea. So as been said earlier, we're looking at Hill 355. This, again, saw a lot of action for the Canadians. And it's called Hill 355, as some of you may be aware, because it's 355 meters above sea level. This is how they named the hills on the maps, because a lot of these are unnamed until they're fought over in conflicts, and that's not just happening at the Korean War. So this was a position that Canadians were at several times or in the area of it. So it was called Little Gibraltar, and as maybe we'll see in some photos, but you can look it up online. It literally looks like the Rock of Gibraltar in a lot of ways. It's quite striking. The Americans called it that, but the Commonwealth, as according to the official history, called it simply just 355. So I might refer to it as 355 as we move along. So the first Canadian action at the area of Hill 355 took place on November 22nd, 1951, with troops from the Royal Canadian Regiment, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, PPCLI, And the Royal 22nd Regiment, nicknamed the Vandus, moved into a new stretch of the front lines, bordering on the at the time American-held Hill 355. The Vandus were just literally getting into their new positions when the Chinese started in a bombardment on the frontline positions. So on the 23rd, the shelling continued on, and the Vandus were attacked by waves of Chinese soldiers. These are known as the human wave attack that the Chinese used throughout the war in an attempt to try to break UN forces. So that afternoon, the Vandus eventually became surrounded as a result of these human wave attacks. But shelling and mortar fire were able to push the Chinese back, stabilizing their position. So nearby, American and Chinese forces fought over the hill itself. The Americans were pushed off, allowing the Chinese to have a better position to overlook the Canadian lines and bring down more fire on top of them. But the Americans were eventually to push them back off the hill on the 25th, and the attack ends. So the Vandus suffer casualties, obviously, in this tough fight. They lost 16 killed, 44 wounded, and 3 taken prisoner. So the RCR come into this story of Hill 355 in October 1952. Again, another area of heavy combat with another Chinese attack. The RCR had been in the position on the hill since early September of that year, and they were under periodic bombardment of their positions from Chinese artillery. So the Chinese began a sustained bombardment, constant fire, on October 22nd, which lasted until the next day, continued bombardment overnight and into the early morning. Early in the evening, around the 23rd, the bombardment got heavier, as these things tend to do, and attacked the RCR's positions. A very short bombardment, but very intense. This unfortunately cut off communications for a few of the RCR platoons, leaving them completely blind, as well as the battalion HQ had no idea what was going on. At the front lines, eventually runners were able to reach the HQ, and a retreat was ordered for these platoons that were cut off before the main Chinese attack had begun. And as I said, the main attack began with heavy bombardment just at sunset. Again, a common tactic to kind of get your enemy off guard, being blinded by the sun. So several of the platoons in their new positions were overrun, forcing them to fall back yet again. Once the position was made clear to the RCR command, they were able to take advantage of the assets in the area, particularly from the other Commonwealth units with their artillery, and ordered a heavy bombardment on the areas where the RCR had fallen back from, been able to basically pummel the area that was just occupied by enemy forces. This was followed by a short, feint counterattack, just to kind of throw off the Chinese where the next main attack would come. Later in the evening, around 10 p.m., the main RCR counterattack began at 1 a.m. On the 24th. A very short, intense firefight took place between small pockets of Chinese resistance, but eventually they were pushed back, and the RCR were able to reoccupy their original positions, as long as being relieved partially by a company from the PPCLI. So again, this is intense fighting, and the RCR unfortunately suffer pretty heavy casualties considering Canadian involvement in the war. They lose 18 killed, 35 wounded, and 14 are taken prisoner at the fighting at Hill 355. So one thing I just wanted to end on, and I'm sure a lot of you, if you follow around from some of the other shows we've done, with particularly the First World War, this sounds kind of familiar. This type of static fighting is very indicative of what defined the Korean War past those major offensives that I mentioned at the beginning. The static warfare is very similar to the First World War. Massed artillery, transpositions, static fighting, stalemate, right? It goes on for an extended period, a number of years, as they try to reach peace negotiations, which don't happen until 1953. So this really defines Canada's war in Korea in a lot of ways, and particularly the RCRs. So again, it was a war of patrols, limited attacks, and defending positions against a mass enemy. So yeah, really striking how similar this is to the First World War. So thanks.
Thank you, Dr. St.Croix. So as you've probably noticed, I am inside the diorama, which we believe it was intended as a rendering of one RCR command post in Korea. So including the Hill 355 engagement. And one of the reasons I believe so, it is because there is a command post sign that we have displayed outside this diorama, but you will see a little later on, it can be retrieved in some of the photographs that we have in our archives. Now I'm going to start walking around with my camera and turn the image so that you can see what we have put together about the Korean War in our permanent gallery. So first of all, this is the Korean War diorama with two officers at a communication table and a map. The map is from a later engagement, though, during the 3 RCR rotation in Korea. And some communication devices specific from the era, but also tin cups, and a lamp to light and keep warm. And this is the stove that was giving the officers some warmth. And now let me go outside of the diorama. First of all, to show you the signpost I have mentioned over here. So between May 1951 and March 1954, the 3 battalions of the Royal Canadian Regiment took turns deploying in Korean Peninsula as part of the 25th Canadian Infantry Brigade in an international force under United Nations command, together with the Royal 22e Regiment and Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. The Royal Canadian Regiment was involved in operations assigned to the 1st Commonwealth Division formed of British, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand units. It was a sector situated on the western flank of the front line north of Seoul, capital city of Korea. 2 RCR deployed between May 1953 and April 1952, and they were confronted with a surprisingly well-defended Chinese position around the Chail settlement, sorry for the pronunciation, forced to retreat. The retreat went well though. And then 1 RCR took over in 1 RCR took over in April 1952 until March 1953. They opposed the Chinese army at Kowang-san, as we've heard from Dr. St.Croix, succeeding to maintain control over the 355-meter high mountain, strategically situated also north of Seoul. Their victory was considered at the time one of the most important obtained by UN command during the Korean War. And then 3 RCR replaced 1 RCR in Korea, arriving at the end of March 1953 to spend a full year south of the 38th parallel. They sustained heavy casualties in the battle for Hill 187 on Jamestown Line, only a few weeks after their arrival in the theater. You can see over here an enlarged image of Hill 355, and the image that we use is in our archives. Alongside the flagpole, which was captured on Hill 355 by members of 1 RCR. Now, more than 26,000 Canadians served during the Korean War, with 526 casualties, of which 148 served under the RCR colors. A service badge and 3 campaign medals were issued. You can see the medal display. I'm going to go closer to the medals. So, Canadian Korea medal with bronze oak leaf worn on the ribbon of the Canadian Korea medal by those who also were mentioned in these patches. United Nations Service Medal Korea, and the medal only approved in 1991, which is actually, yes, it is shown here in the second medal set, the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal for Korea. In addition, many were presented with Valor Awards, as can be seen in our medal selection for the Korean War section. Several members of the RCR received a military cross, rarely bestowed post-Second World War. And for the engagement at Kowang-san, 2 military crosses were awarded, one of which is presented here to Lieutenant Colonel, at the time Lieutenant Cloutier, and Lieutenant Clark. I'm not sure what was his rank at retirement, but as a lieutenant in Korea, he did receive a military cross. Several other awards, such as the military medal, were presented to non-commissioned officers, at least 2 of them for acts of valor during the engagement at Hill 355. And now I am going to direct your attention to our archive collection, a few photographs that are coming from Korean War albums. And here is one RCR, and we start with the command post. You can see the sign I was showing earlier alongside the compound in the background, and the individuals in the photograph are Lieutenant Colonel Campbell, CO of 3 RCR, and Lieutenant Colonel Bingham, CO of 1 RCR. And this photo must have surely been taken at the time of handover. Now, the next photograph shows you Hill 355 in Korea. And if we continue turning the pages, we will see even more images of Hill 355 in this album. That is a collection. It's a collection of photographs put together for 1 RCR tour in Korea. And I'm going to browse very quickly the sign again. Whoops. And more images of the officers in the officers' mess in Korea, 1952. And I want to get to the presentation parade, which actually begins here. There will be several other pictures, if I'm lucky to come across them very quickly. Here. This is the presentation parade, and we can only see an overview of the ranks. It's they were presented with their ribbon for the awards, and later on you will see the 4 individuals who were awarded medals. So here are Sergeant Fowler and Sergeant Enright, and here is Captain here already, and Lieutenant Park. And another album, which is in provenance of Private Arsenault. You can see him here, and you've seen his medals over here, the Korea medal and UN Korea medal. They belong to Private Arsenault, who also put together this scrapbook album of photographs he took during his tour with one RCR in Korea. We can see in these images how life was in the camp and how they interacted with the locals also. And there we are. We are going to conclude our tour today.